Test, test. Good morning, everyone. I'm Nelson Amaya. I'm the solutions architect here at Nolty, and today we are going to talk about empathy-driven development. More than a methodology, a critical skill every engineer should learn. Okay, so we have worked with, or at least heard about behavior-driven development, or BDD, test-driven development, or TDD, but empathy, really? We haven't heard about that. Well, the First Round Review magazine interviewed Andrea Goulet. She's co-founder of Corgi a software company, and she began her career as a copywriter, which is a role that depends on understanding and promoting a connection with readers. So, based on both experiences, she found remarkable similarities between the apparently different skills of copywriting and writing code. So, she said coding and copywriting are more similar than you think. There is a misconception that the programming languages we use are only written for machines, but we don't write code in ones and zeros. We write code in compiled languages so that other humans can read it, whether that's our team or our future selves. Coding is a form of communication. Communication is rooted in empathy. So, software engineers have a lot to gain from leveraging empathy as a tactical skill. So, in fact, Andrea is proud to say that she defined empathy as a core value at Corgi which is a path every tech company should follow. Okay, myths busted. Andrea detected and busted the three myths that she thinks are preventing engineers from learn or refine their empathetic expertise. She explains why leaving communication artifacts in your code is an exercise in empathy. For example, leaving comments, explanations, etc. And that's how she introduced empathy-driven development as a methodology, or as she defines, as a highly procedural framework for embedding this critical skill into engineering teams. She challenges us to see empathy not as an abstraction or an innate talent, but as a powerful, actionable tool that belongs in every engineer's toolbox. So, the first myth that she busted is empathy is just a feeling. She says that most people believe that empathy is just a feeling, and for sure, it definitely involves feelings, but however, that conceptualization of empathy is really limiting. Uh, Based on her research about some types of empathy, she found the cognitive empathy, which she defined as a proactive perspective taking and problem solving. So, does these terms sound familiar to you? Yeah, this definition should be a critical skill for marketers, UX researchers, writers, designers, and of course, engineers. Every engineer should be an excellent problem solver. So that's where empathy begins. So, to summarize, empathy is not this abstract metaphysical enigma. It's a skill we need to respect and a muscle we need to flex. The second myth is empathy is irrelevant to building software. Well, when most people think about the skills needed to be an effective engineer, empathy is probably not the first that comes to mind. However, if you want to be an excellent engineer, you should know how to communicate in addition to knowing how to make an application work. For example, you need to communicate with empathy while writing commit messages, pull requests, naming functions, naming variables, tests, etc. Messages, all of the string parts of coding. We as engineers know that every application code is reviewed and revisited constantly, not only by ourselves, but also by our peers. In fact, sometimes when we revisit our own code, for example, 6 months later, we don't even understand our own code, and it's a common and critical issue in this development industry. We need to take into consideration the future readers of our code, even if it's ourselves. So definitely this should be a critical skill for us as engineers. There is a remarkable statement on Andreas' interview, and it's that diversity and inclusion isn't just about team composition. It's a critical ingredient to building better products that work for everyone. Something that all engineers should strive to do. Training developers in a deeper understanding of empathy is a crucial first step toward that end goal. The third myth is empathy can't be taught. Well, there are some skills that we know we can learn by, for example, reading some books or watching screencasts, but we have the misconception that empathy is either something you have or don't have. Acknowledging that empathy is a trainable skill is the first step in improving on it. Andreas says that it's hard to apply a growth mindset to a trait you think is inherent and fixed, but with a practical breakdown of what empathy is, how to apply it, and how to cultivate it, there is a path forward. As we all know, for a long time, there has been a damaging and limiting stereotype of the socially inept engineer. We as engineers need to get rid of this prototype by working on other skills that are essential to the company and product building. Apart from the technical skills, and communication and empathy are some of those skills. But how can we embed empathy into our engineering teams? Well, like learning a programming language or training for a sport, for example, building empathy should be part of an ongoing practice. Andrea Goulet shares three guiding principles that we can lean on as we start to improve our aptitude for empathy. So the first one is swap blame for honor. Well, we all have faced this situation. We need to revisit old code from another engineer, which is a total mystery and complicated to understand. We think it's a total mess. What a frustrating situation. And I've been there. Our usual reaction is, who the heck wrote this? And then we start blaming her or him. I found a really funny Goulet's quote about it, and it says, if you want to see a history of changes to the code, the default command is git blame on the command line. End of quote. And yeah, that's right. We all are like predisposed to find bad code and to blame others. But shaming the original developer wastes precious time and energy. Goulet says we need to move beyond blame and shame. They are unproductive and the opposite of empathy. Instead, When you approach code, honor the work of the people who came before you. Think, okay, I assume that people did their best work. Why did they choose this solution? That's when you'll get more reasonable answers. Goulet suggests thinking about constraints to help you have more empathy for past developers. She says, no one wakes up in the morning and decides to write the worst code possible. That just doesn't make sense. People are up against real world constraints that impact code quality like time, budget, technical limitations, and unrealistic expectations. Follow the constraints and you'll uncover the deeper reason that the code base isn't up to your expectations. End of quote. Empathy means analyzing problems through another engineer's perspective, which is the base to solve problems and code refactoring, even when it's sometimes hard. The second one is consider your project like an archeological dig. When it comes to constructing empathetic coding practice, Goulet encourages engineers to envision old code bases as archaeological sites. So she says, quote, when archaeologists study an ancient site, they don't have the whole story about what life was like at the time. They have to look for artifacts, pottery, coins, sometimes writing. Similarly, if you leave communication artifacts in your code now, it makes interpreting your code much easier for future developers. End of quote. So based on this, we definitely should have a lot of time to we could save, sorry, a lot of time to the next developer who will take our code by just adding helpful comments to our code, creating meaningful variables names, adding descriptions to the commits and pull requests, etc. And at the same time, we are exercising empathy. Another opportunity to exercise empathy is whenever we interact with someone else. For example, when you send an email, when you send a message on Slack, or a call, etc. However, it's not only about improving our empathy skills. It also will improve our self-confidence and will build trust between our peers and, of course, the whole company. The third one is think like a copywriter. Based on our previous slide, we can conclude that writing is perhaps the most effective way to learn and practice empathy. So we as engineers can benefit from a few lessons from the copywriting world. Copywriters need to learn and practice the empathy skills at an early stage to be able to connect with an audience. For this, Goulet shared her best writing tips for engineers. So the first one is keep your tone casual and conversational. We sometimes feel the need to decorate our language with extravagant jargon or intricate syntax in a professional environment, most of all. The most effective language is clear, concise, and natural. Good writing is simple writing. Okay, the second advice is never underestimate the power of the second person active voice. So Goulet says this is one of the most important pieces of advice she got as a copywriter. So in second person, the writer directly addresses the reader using the word you. So the active voice makes clear that the reader is carrying out the action. So for example, the second person active voice is the difference between the passive, a bug has been detected, and the active that is more empathetic, sorry, you're experiencing a bug. Don't make assumptions. Oh, sorry, this is the previous one. Don't make assumptions. So Don't assume that everyone who is reading your writing knows everything about what you are writing about. If you are writing about, for example, a technical concept, take a bit of time to explain it. If you are using an acronym, spell out each word the first time it's used. That way, your writing is more accessible to readers who have different skills and strengths from yourself. So the question is EDD a methodology every tech company should embrace? Yes, definitely. Thanks to all the experience and research work done by Andrea Goulet and the things she shared on some interviews and blog articles, we can see that we have missed out on empathy-driven development on our engineering careers, but we definitely need to start embracing it. Some final quotes from Andrea. Empathy is what we can optimize for when we are trying to generate a culture of trust. And the end goal with empathy is cultivating a culture where everyone proactively asks, is there something that I can do to make this just a little bit better for the next person who comes along? Andrea has shared many tips on how to build this framework on a company and some diagrams on how she envisions it. However, I think it's a work that should be done by each company to get the most of it and to adapt to each company model. So that's all. I hope you enjoyed this lightning talk. And do you have any questions? You can write them on the YouTube channel. Okay, Jeffrey Nolte says, do you have any insights on how culture can be developed around this where it may not consistently exist across teams? Yeah, well, when where it may not consistently exist across teams, it's a bit hard to implement. However, I think it's not like we have to implement this as a company value and that's all. But I think it's a value that each one of us uh, has to work on and has to exercise and practice. So the empathy as engineers have to start from ourselves, and start like spreading the word and sharing our experiences and being more empathetic to the other engineers and the other people inside the company. I think that's the base to build this methodology all across any company. Herman Palacios says, are there any exercises or sources of information that could help improve the writing to be focused on empathy? Yeah, definitely. In fact, Andrea Goulet has shared some blog articles where she exposes some advices on how to write, not only on the engineering side, but in general. As she was a copywriter, and she now leads a tech company, then she can combine both worlds and give us some advices and her best suggestions for doing this. In fact, I'm going to share some links on this channel at the end of the video. Oscar Arzola says, do you have any interesting book or reading to dig on this matter? Well, as far as I know, there are no books. so far, but as I said, there are some interesting links and articles, so I can share them on this channel. Joshua Jenks says, as you stated, empathy requires practice. Is there a practice for course correction when events take place which display a lack of empathy? Mm, yeah, I think the best practice you can follow is to read yourself the things that you have written. So for example, when you write a piece of code and before you create the pull request, it's a good practice to read your own code one or two times more after you wrote it, and think if you have to read this code 6 months later or 1 year later, will you understand this code? That's a good practice, because as I said in the presentation, sometimes we don't remember what we did on some portion of code, and we don't understand our own code. So that's a good practice. That's like the first step to think of other engineers that will take this code. Gabriela Suarez says, can you give two examples of when an engineer exercised their empathy while working on tech issues and the opposite one? Okay, for example, while working, how can we exercise empathy? So as I said, this is not only when writing code, but also any writing exercise. So for example, when we start writing an email, we can start practicing empathy there. We can be clear, concise, but we can also be empathetic. Every time we have to write anything, as I said, a message on Slack or an email, or even when we have a call, we have an opportunity to practice empathy. So if we practice empathy on our life, our personal life too, we can translate this empathy to our code. So we can think, how can I be empathetic about my code? How can I improve my code, not only by following the best code practices, but also by sharing this code to other engineers and letting them know what did I do here and what this function does and what this variable means. All of that will help to build a better empathy-driven development. And the opposite one, continuing with the Gabriela Suarez question. For example, when we I don't know, when we write some portion of code, if we only have to fix some bug or something like that, and we don't add any comment to that code, we are not being empathetic. We are just like doing our task, our job, and that's all. But we are not thinking more beyond our job. In that case, we are not being empathetic. Or for example, when I don't know, we had a bad day and we have to work on another's project, and we see that this code is not as good as we like, and we start blaming. So that's not empathetic. As I said, we have to think in a different way, and we don't have to waste our energy blaming others, but starting thinking why this was done this way. Pablo Turadi says, hi, just wanted to say, great topic. I feel that empathy is enormous, both the organization, people to people, and the product itself, things to people. The product has to be empathetic to the user. Yeah, that's true, totally true. Okay, Gerardo says there are a lot of something does EDD override other development practices or can work along with them? Yeah, of course. In fact, we can combine all of them because it's not like uh, it's not like if you choose one methodology then you cannot apply another one. In this case, in fact, empathy development driven development, sorry, should be implemented inside any of other methodologies that we use. So for example, uh, when we are doing test driven development, then it should be a good practice from the empathy point of view to add some comments to the tests, because if we only add some tests and we don't describe what those tests are doing, then another engineer won't be able to understand those tests. Jeffrey Nolte says, I'm curious how you feel about commenting to document versus self-documenting code, which is more human readable by nature. Do you have tips on learning this for engineers? Yeah, I always have that that same thought, and I always say like, which is better to document this on a separate document, you know, the README file, or should I add all the comments inside the code? Well, this is what I do is to try to think how specific should I be with my comments. So, for example, I don't think it should be good to have a lot of comments in the README file because it won't be helpful for other engineers to have a lot of explanations and descriptions there. But I think we should keep this as clean as possible, just with the main descriptions, you know, for example, explaining how the project was built, what are the requirements, and basically the steps to, for example, install the project and to start this working. But inside the code, it's a good practice to have more specific comments so the other engineers, when they go inside to see the code, they will understand each one of the functions, each one of the variables, and even there is a good practice that sometimes when you use linters, you know that sometimes you will have to escape some lines from the linter to scan them. It's also a good practice to escape this line from the linter, but also add a description. Why are you escaping this? Because if you only add the escaping line, don't scan this, and that's all, the other engineers won't understand why are you escaping this, and they can think, well, you went to the easy way, but that's not the reason. So if you add descriptions to everything as possible, obviously you don't have to add each comment a comment for each line, but if you can add some helpful descriptions to each portion of code. Okay, Gabriela says, great, thank you. I love your talk. Thank you, Gabi. Gerardo says, it makes total sense. Great topic and very relatable. Thank you, Nelson. Thank you, Gerardo. Jeffrey says, just wanted to share this link as well, which was placed in our chat. This is a really nice resource for naming and labeling, which is key for communication and can be used for engineers. Thank you very much, Jeff. Yeah, I will also share some links on this channel so you can go there and read more information. This is a really interesting topic and there is a lot of information about it. So Thank you very much for this opportunity. And Hilam says, thanks, Nelson. That's okay. Thank you, Hilam. So I think that's all. Thank you very much, and see you next time.